Welcome to the next session. Today we are discussing the central theme of Weberian sociology, that is his concept of rationalization. And we are discussing rationalization along with his arguments about social action, another very important theme of his sociological analysis. So in the previous classes, we had two classes on Weber. One, we looked at his personal life in a very brief manner, and also looked at the intellectual climate or intellectual influences of Max Weber during his time, which really shaped his thinking, and which really prompted him to look at sociology in a very unique manner. And in the second class, which we just concluded in the previous session, we discussed the very specific contributions of Weber in terms of his methodological arguments as well as his overall arguments about the distinctive character of sociology. So I hope you remember that he played a very significant role in the development of anti-positivistic framework on methodological on research methodology, which proved to be extremely important. We had an elaborate discussion on that. So today we are going to discuss his central theme, rationalization, and his idea of social action. So these three themes, themes of rationality, rationalism, and or rationalization, all the three terms they appear very prominently in his argument, and as we can say that this theme of rationalization, it really occupies the central position in Weberian sociology. If somebody asks you what is the most dominant or central concern or the overarching theme of Weberian sociology, most often this is given as one of the important reasons or important themes, because he is using this framework of rationalization to explore questions of social action, on economy, on religion, on almost every aspect of modern social life. So it really occupies a central place, and it is extremely important for us to understand what does Weber mean by this term rationalization. So for Weber, all cultures exhibit rationality, in that all people can give reasons which make sense for their behavior, but only in the West does a particular type of rationality based on bureaucracy, calculation, and the like became dominant. And this is a very crucial point, a very controversial point as well, because he is saying that rationality is usually understood as the way in which you give reason to certain things. Okay, we say that human beings are rational animals. Okay, we are rational beings. We even before we act certain things, we always think about its consequences. So we attach quite a lot of, or we involve in rational thinking. So Weber says that this ability to reason, there's nothing unique about any society, that every society, every human society has this ability. They attach some amount of reason to their action. If somebody asks you why did you, or why do you behave like that, they will have certain reasons. Okay, they will have certain rationality, and this rationality could be based on magic, it could be based on tradition, it could be based on religion, or it could be based on some other kind of justificatory systems. But what Weber is saying is extremely interesting. It is also extremely problematic. It is also extremely controversial. So for what he says is that all cultures exhibit rationality, in that all people can give reasons which make sense of their behavior. But only in the West does a particular type of rationality based on bureaucracy, calculation, and the like becomes dominant. So Weber is saying something very, very different. Weber is saying that a particular kind of rationality emerged in Europe during a particular time, and especially he connects it with the emergence of modernity, with say 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and he says that this kind of rationality is qualitatively different from other kind of rationalities that are existing across the globe, and the kind of rationality that existed in Europe before this particular time. So that is an extremely important point. And you know that one of the major criticisms against Weber is that his sociology, just like that of Durkheim and Weber and almost all major Western classical sociologists, was also heavily Eurocentric. Okay, they assumed that the Europe is the central place of all intellectual activities, and on the basis of European yardstick, they evaluated other cultures. So this rationalization is for Weber the master process of modernity. So Weber defines modernity through this process of rationalization. That is the employment of a particular kind of rationality. We will examine what is this particular kind. A particular kind of rationalization where a particular type of reasons are attributed, or human behavior is molded, or human behavior is shaped on the basis of certain type of rationality, and that, he says, is the master process of modernity. But at the same time, we also need to know that he does not give any kind of a particular definition for this. What does this kind of a rationality mean? Whereas he has given definition for ideal type, he has given definition for a number of other central themes, but this he kind of leaves it rather ambiguous. But it's important for us to understand what does he mean by that. So rationalization, the master process of modernity, results in less magical, increasingly disenchanted world in which science becomes dominant as tradition and religion lose their power. So here he is bringing in some more familiar themes that are connected with the rise of modernity. So he says that this master process of modernity results in a less magical, increasingly disenchanted world. So this we already had some discussion about that, and we will come back to this term disenchantment later when we discuss Weberian discussion on religion. But what is important in Weberian argument is that the modern world is less magical. Okay, modern world, we are increasingly able to understand the functioning of modern world without the help of magical or religious or theological or metaphysical explanations. We don't require those kind of explanations anymore. And there is a process of disenchantment of the world. Modern humans are no longer enchanted by the natural phenomenon or social phenomenon. When the lightning strikes, when there is a thunder, or when some natural phenomena take place, we are no longer enchanted. Or nor do we believe that these things are taking place on the basis of certain all-powerful, almighty God. We don't think that. We have moved away from those kind of enchanted world. We are modern human beings are no longer enchanted. We are disenchanted lot. So human beings are moving out of this enchanted world, and science becomes the dominant as a tradition, and religion is losing its power. So this is a theme that we are familiar with. We have discussed it again and again, how science was seen as replacing the kind of an explanatory potentials of religion and magic and other things. And more than the arrival of science, or along with that, Weber argues that this kind of new rationality, or the kind of a peculiar rationality, it involves a systematic ordering of social life. Okay, a completely novel type of ordering is taking place in the modern society. And this theme we discussed already when we discussed Karl Marx, when we discussed the rise of industrialization, when we discussed the establishment of factory and siren. We talked about the kind of a particular order, but Weber is taking it to a much higher level. So while the social order of traditional society rests on an organically prescribed cycle of natural life bolstered by habit and custom, the social order of modern society reflects the increasing power of human beings to control the social and natural forces of the world. It's an extremely important one. He's talking about how in the modern world, how human beings are able to create kind of orders which they really want. They are no longer following the kind of an organically prescribed cycle of natural life. You know that when we are talking about a primitive tribal society, okay, their understanding of social order, their understanding of society is completely dependent upon the nature. Okay, what are the things that are available for them, and how should they meet their how should they carry on with their life every day, how should they procure their food, okay, how to survive. These things were completely dependent on the nature. And when human beings started agriculture, we can say that we gained more higher degree of mastery over the nature. But still, every agrarian society, every agricultural society, they depend upon the cycle of the nature, on the monsoons, on the summers, on the winters, because they simply depend on that. On the other hand, when it comes to the modern times, Weber argues that we are able to create our own social order. It doesn't mean that we are no longer dependent on nature, but increasingly human social life is being divorced of its dependency over the nature. So it's modern society reflects the increasing power of human beings to control the social and natural forces of the world. And this is seen as the implication or as a consequences of modernity. After all, modernity promised you increased control over the nature, increased mastery over the nature. Modern social order is a distinctly rational order, a product of deliberate calculation, willful planning, scientific management, the exploitation of expert knowledge, and the application of advanced technologies. And this, in a way, we can say that this kind of summarizes what is Weberian argument of rationalization. It's a product of a deliberate calculation. Okay, increasingly, Weber argues, increasingly each and every aspect of human calculation, human life is being deliberated, is based on deliberate calculation. Okay, and this calculation follows willful planning, scientific management. And what does scientific management means? We really micromanage each and every aspect of that. You look into the questions of efficiency, you look into the questions of safety, you look into the ways of getting things done at the easiest way. The exploitation of expert knowledge, okay, highly specialized people are available, or highly specialized bodies of knowledge is available, and this knowledge is being used to make the things highly efficient, and an application of advanced technologies. So a combination of all these tendencies together, Weber argues, this peculiar kind of rationality, something so central to modernity, emerged, and this kind of rationality was not available to Europeans before modernity, and he would say that even during his time it was not the dominant kind of rationality available to non-Europeans as well. A very, very important and as well as controversial claim. So Weber then distinguishes two types of rationality. One is a substantive rationality, the other one is a formal rationality. So substantive rationalism and formal rationalism. Substantive rationalism is directed towards values resulting in utilitarian and social ethical blessing granted by a prince or other authority. This differs from formal rationalism based on calculation and pragmatism. So in substantial rationalism, this rationalism is supposed to uphold certain important values, and it is not for the sake of doing certain things for the sake of instrumentality or efficiency. Rather, this rationalism upholds certain kind of values. So he argues that is directed towards values resulting in utilitarian, social, ethical blessings granted by a prince or other authority. So in its enactment, in its very meaning, in its very purpose of this particular action, you will be able to see this kind of upholding of this of certain values, and they are not simply used simply for the case of pragmatism or an instrumental manner. And formal rationality is often irrational when viewed from a substantive point of view. George Ritzer's argument about McDonaldization that undermines values of democracy and individualism in the name of efficiency. Okay. For example, one of the examples of formal rationality is that you try to make things very formal, very efficient, but that many times undermines the substantial value behind that. And this idea about McDonaldization, George Ritzer develops this concept to explain the process of globalization. He argues that in whichever McDonald outlet that you walk into in anywhere in the world, the experience will be same, the production will be same, the taste will be same, the ambience will be same. So, but on the other side, this standardization in the name of efficiency has, has a huge flip side. It has quite a lot of negative consequences in the sense that it really it really is against the values of democracy. It is against the values of difference. It is against the value of creativity or individualism and a host of other things. A chef in a McDonald's outlet will not be able to use any of his own ideas because everything is standardized. Okay, so Weber brings in these two types of rationalism. The rise of rationalism in the West is tied to the emergence of capitalism, the Protestant ethic, bureaucracy, and science. So this is the larger set of combinations that Weber brings in. Emergence of capitalism, Protestant ethic, we will have elaborate discussion on that, as well as on bureaucracy and science. Science we already had a discussion. So he comes to this question of rationalization and differentiation. What is the kind of relation between rationalization and differentiation? Weber views societies as becoming increasingly differentiated as different life spheres such as art, science, and ethical reasoning become separated from one another, especially from religion. Each sphere develops its own particular inner logic and standards of evaluation. And this is an extremely important point. Okay? When society becomes more and more heterogeneous, it becomes more and more complex, more and more diverse, Weber argues that there is a process of differentiation take place. For example, look at the questions, look at the cases of education, health, say governance or politics, or family relationship. Okay, each of these fields, which are some of the important things, or entertainment for that matter, each of these things were very closely connected with each other in the early societies, in the traditional societies. And more importantly, all of them were very specifically connected with religion. Okay, your system of education was very closely connected with religion. Most of the time, what was conducted or communicated through education was nothing but religious ideas, or it was heavily influenced by religion. Medicine, for that matter, medicine was heavily influenced by religion. Then all other aspects that we discussed about family, about governance, about politics, about entertainment, about sports, about education, each and every of these spheres, life spheres, were entangled with each other and mostly connected with religion. And as societies progress, as societies become more and more modern, these life spheres become more and more independent. They become more and more autonomous, and they develop their own particular inner logic and standards of evaluation, and they are increasingly getting divorced from religion. We know about secular education. We know that increasingly modern medicine is increasingly getting divorced from religion, education, or family matters, or politics. Each and every of these important life spheres are becoming more and more autonomous. They are getting divorced from the influence of religion. So modern world as increasingly as fragmented, devoid of a cohesive bond of morality emerging from religion. Okay, and this is exactly the point that Weber talks when he talks about secularization as well. He is arguing that society is becoming more and more secular, and the process of secularization and process of differentiation are extremely interconnected. Secularization, without differentiation, secularization is not possible. The very fact that religion becomes your private sphere, okay, it involves this process of differentiation. So his arguments on rationalization, so then he extends this argument of rationalization to explain social action, on economy and authority and so on. So Weber argues that in a modern society, exemplified like places like Western Europe, is characterized by increasing rationality, where human beings use calculation, use modern knowledge and science and expert knowledge and technologies to attain the kind of a most efficient way of getting things done. And this he extends, we are taking up this example of social action, he extends it to the analysis of social action, and social action really is one of his central themes. So sociology, Weber states, is a science concerning itself with the interpretative understanding of social action and thereby with a causal explanation of its cause and consequences. Thereby, there is a, yeah. So Weber, it's a kind of a definition of sociology as per Weber. And remember, we discussed Durkheim's definition of sociology, where he defines sociology as the study of social facts. So here Weber says it's a science concerning itself with the interpretative understanding of social action. Okay, so here the most important aspect is social action seen as interpretative. It's not a mere fact out there for you to go and collect. You need to interpret. You need to interpret. Remember our discussion about value. You need to objectively understand the subjective meaning attached by actors towards their action, and thereby with a causal explanation of its causes and consequences. So this is how Weber perceives the subject matter of sociology, as sociology as a science that studies social action, but the study of social action is through the interpretative understanding. The idea of Verstehen comes into picture. So social action is present wherever individual attaches a subjective meaning to their behavior, a motive, a purpose, or an intention. And you know that this covers almost every aspect of human action, maybe except some reflexive action where we don't really think and act, very unintended actions or very reflexive kind of actions, but that constitutes a fraction of this entire human action, because otherwise human action is completely intended. We attach motive, we attach purpose, we attach intention, and this is so Weberian argument, or Weber's argument about social action is behavior plus this meaning, the subjective meaning to their behavior. It's not a behavior alone. It's not that people act on the basis of certain stimulus, something that we discussed in the previous class. So he identifies 4 types of social action, each constructed as a pure or ideal type. In reality, he acknowledges any particular instance of behavior typically consists of some combination of these pure types. So then he proceeds to develop ideal types of social action, 3 types of social action, and he says that these are ideal types. They are pure or ideal type, and in the previous class we discussed that ideal types are a kind of a mental constructs. Weber argues that ideal types do not exist in reality, but it is an ideal, it's a conceptual construct for us to contrast with certain kind of a concrete experience or concrete examples. I gave you the example of an ideal student, and you know that this ideal student does not exist, but this ideal typical picture of an ideal student is always helpful to compare student with this person who has all the qualities of an ideal student. So these 4 types of actions. The first one is affectual action, is determined by emotions or feeling states. Emotional influences become a dominating factor in deciding the nature of action, most reflexive unintended action. So the first one is about how we many times end up doing things when we are heavily influenced by emotion, and this because human beings are emotional animals, and a large part of our social action, how much ever we say that we are rational, but we know that we are not rational in the Weberian sense. We are heavily emotional animals. So when we are angry, when we are frightened, when we are overcome with certain kind of emotions of grief, revenge, sexual urge, or a host of other kind of emotions and drives, we act in a very, very different way. So Weber argues that this constitutes one of the most important type of action. And the second one is this traditional action. Traditional action is determined by ingrained habituation along with other customary and unpremeditated daily behaviors. This might include, for example, the ritual greeting we unthinkingly give our colleagues, when we arrive at work each morning. So this traditional action is because they are traditional. We act in certain way because that's how it has been, or we are quite accustomed to that. We are quite used to that. And if you look at our day-to-day activities, starting the moment we get up, how do we do? How do we interact with others? What are the words that we use? What kind of food that we eat? A host of things will be can be analyzed or understood on the basis of this traditional action, because they are. He says it's because of this ingrained habituation. We are so habituated with that. They are ingrained in our behavior without our own knowledge, and along with other customary and unpremeditated daily behaviors. This might include, for example, the ritual, a host of examples. And we know that especially when we talk about tradition is considered to be something important, because we think that this is how things have been done since the time immemorial, isn't it? We use this term immemorial quite often, as if there is no end to any social practice, or things have been the same for the past so many centuries, while we know that that was not the case. But the second type of action that Weber highlights is traditional action. And the third one is value rational action, where which is determined by a conscious belief in the value for its own sake, for some ethical, aesthetic, religious or other form of behavior. Such action carried out regardless of consequences is governed by a commitment to certain higher duty or moral ideal. Example, non-violence. The third type of action or most important motivation for human action, according to Weber, is the commitment to certain values. We behave on the basis of emotions, we behave on the basis of certain tradition. We also behave, our actions are also heavily influenced by certain commitment to certain ideals. And this ideal could be commitment to your own religion, your own caste, your own ideology, certain ideals. Okay, the people, the suicide bombers or the terrorists who are getting ready to be killed by opponents, or the kind of a host of other examples. And the example that Weber gives is that of non-violence. Gandhiji, for example, person who tried his level best not to compromise on this whole question of non-violence. So this ideal of non-violence really governed Gandhi's tactics, his tactics and his strategies about fighting with the British. He did not want to compromise on that. So in every society, Weber argues that there would be certain ideals that would really shape the kind of social action. And the fourth one is the most important one, as per Weberian sociology, is the instrumentally rational action. It is the instrumentally rational action is determined by the means-end calculation, something that we discussed a bit earlier about the use of science, use of calculation, use of expert knowledge, because this here is the calculation is only what is the most efficient way of getting things done. How can you reach from A to point B the most easiest, shortest way? So the efficiency becomes the central concern, is determined by means-end calculations. Action is rational in the sense, Weber states, when the end and the means and the secondary results are all rationally taken into account and weighed. So here they are devoid of every other concern. Okay, they are not concerned about tradition, they are not concerned about emotion, they are not concerned about value. Their only concern is to get things done in the most efficient manner, in the shortest of the time. And that ruthless, that heavily technologically driven way of getting things done, Weber argues, is a modern phenomenon, and that he says is the hallmark of modernity. So affectual action and traditional action, Weber explains, because they are more or less unconscious and unthinking, are on the borderline between truly meaningful action and merely reactive behavior. Because these two actions, especially affective action and traditional action, they are more or less unconscious and unthinking, isn't it? Especially when we are overwhelmed with emotions. We don't really reflect over things. We tend to act impulsively. So are on the borderline between truly meaningful action and merely reactive behavior. The thoughtfulness characteristic of instrumentally rational action takes the form of calculation, the conscious and deliberate appraisal of competing lines of conduct evaluated according to their probable cost, consequences, and the likelihood of success. So Weber argues that the meaning of the term social action in its truest sense or in its fullest sense will be in the case of instrumental rational action, because the person or the group of people will think through that. They will think about the probable cost, they will think about the consequences, they will think about to what extent it's supposed to be a successful one, or what is the possibility of failure. All these aspects would be kind of evaluated. So the Weber argues that this thoughtfulness characteristic of value rational action takes the form of conviction, the conscious and the deliberate adoption of certain values or ideals, seen as an ultimate commitment to certain values. And when it comes to value rational action, the kind of a thoughtfulness characteristic of the value rational action takes the form of conviction. When it comes to value rational action, you know that you may have to pay a price. For example, when you stand against corruption, against the government, or when you stand against the state atrocities, or the police violence, or the corruption in judiciary, you know that you will have to pay a price, but you are convinced. Your conviction really pushes you, conviction really drives you to take up a kind of a particular position, and this conscious and deliberate adoption of certain values or ideals, and this seen as an ultimate commitment to certain values. Then rationalization of action involves the displacement of unreflective emotional behavior, affectual action, and the unthinking acceptance of ancient customs, traditional action, in favor of the deliberate adaptation to situation in terms of self-interest, instrumentally rational action, and the deliberate formulation of ultimate values, value rational action. And this is his scheme of things, the ultimate. So Weber is not saying that okay, these are the four characteristics, but Weber is also saying that there is a gradual but there is a decisive shift from the emotional and the traditional action to more value oriented as well as instrumentally rational action. So rationalization of action involves the displacement of unreflective and emotional behavior, okay, and unthinking acceptance of ancient customs in favor. So these two things are being slowly and gradually displaced in favor of the deliberate adaptation to situations in terms of self-interest, the instrumental rational action, and deliberate formulation of ultimate value. So increasing domination of instrumental rational action in the modern world. So Weber would argue that the most important characteristic feature or most important characteristic of modern world is that by displacing emotional and traditional action, the instrumental rational action is emerging as the dominant one, of course along with the value oriented action. And he gives example of capitalism as the manifestation of increasing instrumentality of rational action. The rational behavior of the individual in the modern world is, Weber argues, increasingly characterized by calculation rather than conviction, by the self-interest adaptation of circumstances rather than the principled commitment to ideals in the modern world. And capitalism, we will discuss that in the coming class. Weber argues that capitalism is a perfect example of the instrumental rational action. When you want to increase, when you invest in money, when you want to reap profit, when you want to earn more money out of your investment, you act in a completely rational action, instrumental rational action. You don't think about emotions, you don't think about tradition, you don't think about certain huge lofty values. Rather, you act in a most instrumental manner. Your only concern is how to maximize your profit, how to get back your investment along with the profit. And especially capitalism, we'll come back to that later. The economic activities in general are supposed to be, they fall under this category of instrumental rational action. but Weber says that capitalism in particular has quite a lot of such features. So, as I told you earlier, in this modern world, Weber argues this rational behavior of the individual in the modern world is increasingly characterized by calculation rather than conviction. People again, these are highly problematic arguments. Again, Weber argues that you don't see this kind of things in pure forms. Many times, the ideas are, you will find mixture of different kind of actions. It will be very difficult for you to pinpoint and say that, okay, this particular action is only emotional action or traditional action or instrumental action. Most often you will find, elements of different types of action in a given scenario. But Weber's point is very clear. When a society modernizes, the instrumental rational action becomes the most dominant one by replacing the emotional, traditional and value-oriented action, because the calculation becomes the most dominant one rather than conviction. The values lose their weight by the self-interested adaptation to circumstances rather than the principled commitment to ideals in the modern world. So this is one of his first set of arguments about social action. And here what we saw today is his application of the process of rationalization to explain to explain this concept of social action. So here we discussed his definition of social action, we discussed his definition of rationalism or rationalization, and we also discussed his characterization of 4 different types of actions, and we also discussed his final argument, the most important argument, that the modern society, the instrumental rational action is dominating, or it is gradually but decidedly it is overcoming, it is displacing other forms of action such as value oriented, traditional and affective actions. Okay, so this is his larger argument, and we will see a parallel kind of argument when he discusses authority, when he discusses economy, when he discusses religion and a host of other things. Okay, so this is the central theme. Is, as I told you, this rationalization is his Weber's central theme, and he applies this theme to understand and to explain each of these concepts. So I am winding up today. We'll discuss the remaining classes, remaining section in the coming class. Thank you.